Ladies and gentlemen, adjust your headphones, prepare yourselves, because the story I am about to tell is one to send shivers down your spine. It's about the biggest technical scandal in Formula One history, and at the center of it all is a phone call that few people know about, but which revealed a truth the FIA tried to hide for years. We are talking about Senna picking up the phone and saying, straight up, without fear, Schumacher's Benetton is illegal. It must be investigated. And do you know what the most incredible part is? He was completely right. But the story of this discovery, my friends, is much more complex and fascinating than you can imagine. Let's go back to the beginning of 1994. The stage was set for Senna's definitive coronation. After years at McLaren watching Alain Prost dominate with the Williams Renault, the Brazilian finally got what he desired: the seat in the best team on the grid. Everyone was already writing the headlines for the fourth world championship. The best driver in the world, in the best car in the world. It was mathematical, it was inevitable, it was destiny. But there was one detail no one counted on. The FIA, that entity that loves to tinker with regulations, decided that 1994 would be the year to clean up Formula One. The electronic party was over. Active suspension? Banned. Traction control? Illegal. ABS? Out. Launch control on starts? No way. The idea was noble: return to the pure driver, to raw talent, to the man controlling the machine without the help of computers. Everyone went back to the drawing board. Everyone had to redesign their cars. Everyone accepted the new rules. Well, almost everyone. Brazil, Interlagos, March 27, 1994. The first race of the season. Senna is at home, on pole position. The crowd is delirious. That sea of Brazilian flags turning the racetrack into a green and yellow festival. The red lights switch on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they go out. The cars roar down the Senna S straight, and something extraordinary happens. Michael Schumacher, starting from second position, simply flies. I'm not exaggerating. The German left that starting line as if he had been launched by a catapult. Zero wheel spin, perfect revs, traction that seemed glued to the asphalt. Senna, who was universally recognized as the absolute master of starts, the man with superhuman sensitivity on the accelerator pedal, was left eating dust. And look how interesting. While everyone was spinning, sliding, struggling to control the car, Schumacher's Benetton simply accelerated in a straight line as if it were on rails. The crowd was stunned. The commentators were stunned. And Senna became suspicious. The Brazilian ended up winning that race because Schumacher, ironically, spun out on his own while leading comfortably. But that start kept gnawing at Ayrton's mind. He knew every technical detail of Formula One. He worked side by side with the engineers. He knew exactly what was possible with an accelerator pedal, a clutch, and a V8 engine without electronic control. And what he saw in that start simply did not align with the physics he knew. Second race of the season, Pacific GP in Ida, Japan. Senna on pole position again. And again, Schumacher has an absolutely phenomenal start. He passed the Brazilian as if Senna were standing still on the grid. And it wasn't just the start, it was the traction out of the slow corners too. The Benetton B194 seemed to have a supernatural grip. While other cars were sliding, spinning, losing time, modulating the throttle to avoid losing traction, Schumacher's car simply accelerated flat out and drove away. That's when Senna began to act. Between Japan and the third race in Imola, the Brazilian did something few people know. He picked up the phone and started making calls. They weren't casual calls, they weren't paddock gossip. They were direct, objective warnings to specific people, trusted journalists he had known for years, people within the FIA he respected. And the message was always the same, direct and straightforward. Benetton is using illegal electronic systems. Schumacher's car has traction control. It has launch control. You need to investigate this. You need to understand the weight of these words coming from Senna. This wasn't just any driver complaining about a rival. It was the three-time world champion, the guy who had more technical experience than 99% of the paddock, the driver who was known for spending hours and hours with engineers debating every detail of the car. When Senna said something was wrong, it was because it was wrong. He had evidence. He had his sensors, which were his eyes, his ears, and especially that unique feeling that only the greatest drivers possess. The evidence Senna had collected was impressive. First, there were the impossible starts. In 1994, without electronic aids, making a good start was an extremely difficult art. The driver had to hold the clutch at the perfect point, rev the engine to a specific RPM, gradually release the clutch while modulating the throttle to prevent the wheels from spinning, and also change gears at the exact moment. All of this in fractions of a second, with his heart pounding with adrenaline, with dozens of cars around him. Schumacher was making perfect starts with a consistency that was statistically impossible for a human. Second, there was the sound. Senna listened to the cars. During practice, he paid attention to the noise the Benetton made coming out of corners, and the sound was different. It didn't have that typical engine variation when the driver modulates the throttle to control wheel spin. The sound was constant, smooth. It had a pattern that suggested electronic intervention. It was subtle, but to someone with Senna's trained ear, it was screamingly obvious. Third, there were the telemetry data that Williams had managed to collect before the total ban. The numbers showed that the Benetton had a longitudinal acceleration, especially coming out of slow corners, that made no mathematical sense considering the power of the Ford engine they were using. It was as if the car had 50 extra horsepower, or as if it had supernatural grip on the asphalt. But then we arrive at the Imola weekend, and that was a weekend that changed Formula One forever. It was already a cursed weekend from the start. Rubens Barrichello had a serious crash in Friday practice, was unconscious, and had to be taken to the hospital by helicopter. On Saturday, during qualifying, the young Austrian Roland Ratzenberger suffered a fatal accident. The paddock was in shock, but the race had to happen on Sunday, May 1st, 1994, Autodromo Enzo e Dino Ferrari. Schumacher was on pole position for the first time that season, and it wasn't just any pole, it was a dominant pole. Senna was in second. The start was chaotic, there was an accident involving several cars right away, and the safety car came out. When the race restarted on lap 7, Senna was glued to Schumacher, pressuring him, looking for an opportunity. At Tamburello, the fastest corner on the circuit, taken at over 300 kilometers per hour, something went terribly wrong. The world stopped. Formula One lost its greatest hero. Brazil lost a son, and Senna's suspicions about Benetton were left without their biggest defender. But the story, contrary to what many people think, did not end there. In fact, it was just beginning. With the deaths of Senna and Ratzenberger on the same weekend, the FIA was under brutal pressure from all of society. Safety became the absolute #1 priority. But along with the safety investigations, they started investigating absolutely everything in the paddock. And guess which team was at the center of attention? Benetton, of course. Right after the Monaco GP, the FIA did something unprecedented. They confiscated Benetton's electronic control system for a detailed forensic analysis. And what they found was absolutely shocking. There was a hidden menu in the car's software. To access it, the mechanics needed to perform a specific sequence of commands on the steering wheel and the cockpit buttons. It was literally like a secret video game code, those combinations you type to unlock special powers. And what was inside that secret menu? Absolutely everything that was banned by the FIA. It had launch control, the automatic starting system that perfectly controlled the clutch and throttle for a perfect getaway. It had traction control, which automatically cut engine power when it detected a loss of grip. It had engine mapping options that shouldn't even exist under the 1994 regulations. When the FIA confronted Benetton, the team's response was, shall we say, creative. They claimed that the code was merely residual, programming remnants from the previous year that they simply hadn't removed. According to them, the systems were there in the software, but were completely deactivated and were never used. The FIA asked the obvious question, then why keep them in the code? And Benetton's answer was even more surprising. It was complicated to remove. It would take too much work to rewrite all the software. Think carefully about the logic of that. A Formula One team, with some of the best software engineers in the world, with a multi-million-dollar budget, was saying they couldn't simply delete unwanted lines of code. It was like having a nuclear missile button in your car and saying, "Don't worry, it doesn't work. We just forgot to take it out." Who would believe that? But wait, because the story gets even better. In July of that year, during the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim, something happened that showed just how much Benetton was willing to risk to gain an advantage. During a pit stop for Jos Verstappen, Schumacher's teammate, the car literally exploded into flames during refueling. It was an apocalyptic scene. Burning fuel everywhere, mechanics running and diving to the ground, fire climbing towards the suspended fuel tanks. The investigation into that fire revealed something that left the entire paddock speechless. Benetton had removed a safety filter from the refueling system. And why did they do that? To gain a few meager seconds in pit stop time. The filter was mandatory precisely to prevent this type of accident, but the team thought, to hell with safety, we want faster refueling. Verstappen suffered burns, several mechanics were injured, but Benetton only received a fine and continued competing normally. We then arrive in August at the Belgian Grand Prix in Spa-Francorchamps. Schumacher dominated the race from start to finish, an authoritative victory on one of the most challenging tracks on the calendar. But in the post-race technical inspection, they discovered something irregular. The car's plank was outside the technical specifications. Let me explain this technically so you understand the severity. All cars in 1994 had to have a wooden plank installed on the underside of the floor. This plank was a control device to prevent the cars from running too low, scraping the ground. The maximum allowed wear on this plank was 1 millimeter. If it exceeded that, the car was running too low, generating more downforce than allowed, which was a gigantic aerodynamic advantage. Schumacher's Benetton plank had wear of 7.4 millimeters in some places. To give you an idea of what this means, the lower the car runs, the more aerodynamic force it generates, the more speed it has in corners, the more grip it achieves. It's a colossal advantage. Schumacher was disqualified from that race, but Benetton's defense was, once again, convenient. They claimed there was contact with another car on the first lap that damaged the suspension, making the car run lower. Too much of a coincidence, don't you think? After all these irregularities, the FIA finally took a tougher stance. Schumacher was suspended for 2 races. Officially, the penalty was for ignoring black flags at the British GP. But everyone in the paddock knew it was the accumulation of all the controversies and irregularities. The FIA's patience had run out. But here is the detail. Even with all these penalties, fines, and disqualifications, Michael Schumacher arrived at the last race of the year in Adelaide, Australia, with only a 1-point advantage over Damon Hill, who was now driving the Williams and trying to honor Senna's memory by taking the championship for the team. The Adelaide race was dramatic from start to finish. Schumacher was leading when, on lap 48, he hit the wall in a high-speed corner. The German managed to return to the track, but his car was visibly damaged. Hill saw the golden opportunity and attacked. He attempted an overtake on the inside in a fast corner, and then something happened that is debated to this day. Schumacher steered the car inwards, completely closing the door in a way that many considered unfair and even deliberate. The 2 cars touched, both retired from the race right there, and Michael Schumacher was the world champion by a single point. Many analysts and drivers accused the move of being deliberate. They said the German preferred to take both of them out of the race than risk losing the lead. Flavio Briatore, the Benetton boss, laughed in everyone's face when questioned about it. Michael Schumacher, at just 25 years old, was the new Formula One world champion. But what did that title taste like? That is the question that echoes to this day. And here comes the part that many people don't know, the confessions that came in the following years, and which proved exactly what Senna had suspected. In 2003, almost 10 years later, Willem Todt, who had been Benetton's aerodynamic engineer in 1994, gave an interview to a specialized magazine, and he confirmed straight up, yes, we had launch control, yes, it was in the software, yes, it worked perfectly. When the journalist asked if the system had been used during the races, Todt gave that nervous smile and said, "I cannot confirm or deny that. I cannot confirm or deny." In other words, they had an illegal system that worked perfectly, but they won't admit they used it. It's like having a Ferrari in the garage and claiming you only ride a bicycle. In 2007, Charlie Whiting, who was the FIA technical delegate in 1994 and later became the Formula One race director, gave an even more revealing interview. He admitted, "We knew something was wrong with that Benetton car. The starts were simply impossible to be done with that consistency by a human being. But the problem is that we could not definitively prove that they activated the system during the races. The code was there, but we had no way to prove they used it." Are you understanding what this means? The FIA itself admitted that they knew something was wrong, but they couldn't prove enough for a more severe punishment. Everyone knew, but they stayed in that technical cat-and-mouse game. And there's more. In 2019, when Netflix released the documentary about Michael Schumacher's life, several former members of the Benetton team were interviewed. And although no one directly admitted to the use of illegal systems, the subtext was screamingly obvious. A former engineer said on camera with a little smile on his face, "We were very creative in 1994. Very, very creative indeed." And he winked, creative. That became the new code word for cheating in Formula One. Let me explain to you, in a very technical way, how these systems worked and why they gave such an absurd advantage. Let's start with launch control. In a 1994 start, without electronic aids, the driver had a Herculean task. He needed to hold the clutch at the ideal point, rev the engine to a certain RPM, gradually release the clutch while modulating the accelerator with millimeter precision to prevent the rear wheels from spinning, and also change gears at the exact moment. All of this in less than 3 seconds, with his heart beating 1,000 times a minute, with 25 cars around, with millions of dollars at stake. With launch control, the process was ridiculously simpler. The driver simply accelerated flat out, released the clutch completely, and the computer did absolutely everything else. The system automatically controlled the engine RPM, modulated the power to prevent wheel spin, and changed gears at the ideal moment. It was comparing a human with a robot. The advantage at the start could easily be 3, 4, 5 positions. And traction control was even more valuable during the race. Coming out of slow corners, especially on wet or low-grip tracks, the driver constantly needed to feel the car's traction limit. He had to modulate the accelerator dozens of times per lap, always on that fine line between accelerating as much as possible without losing grip. It was a delicate dance that required total concentration and a supernatural feeling. With traction control, the driver could simply floor the accelerator and let the computer do the work. The system detected loss of traction in milliseconds and momentarily cut the ignition, returning the power as soon as grip returned. The driver could be much more aggressive. Was not afraid of spinning, did not need all that sensitivity. The computer saved him. We are talking about colossal advantages here. They are not tenths of a second. They are whole seconds per lap on some tracks. In Monaco, for example, with all those slow 90-degree corners, traction control could be worth 2-3 seconds per lap. It's the difference between pole position and not even making it into Q3. So let's do the final math here. Michael Schumacher won the 1994 championship by just 1 point over Damon Hill. A single point. If he had lost just one of the races he won, he would not be champion. And how many of those victories were achieved with illegal advantages? Impossible to know for sure, but the suspicions are strong in at least 5 or 6 races. And here is the saddest part of all. Ayrton Senna, the man who was right, who tried to warn about the cheating, who made those calls trying to defend the integrity of the sport, did not live to see his suspicions confirmed. He died still carrying that frustration of knowing he was being robbed, of knowing he had the talent and should have the best car, but was losing to someone who was playing dirty. Imagine his agony. Imagine waking up every day knowing you are the best driver in the world, knowing you worked your whole life to get there, and being defeated not because of a lack of talent, not because of your own mistake, but because someone is cheating. And the worst part, knowing it and not being able to prove it definitively. It must have been psychological torture. Now, I will be fair here because it is important to be balanced. Michael Schumacher was an absolute phenomenon. The guy had absurd natural talent. 7 world titles, 91 victories, records that lasted more than a decade until they were broken by Lewis Hamilton. He revolutionized the way drivers worked with teams, the level of physical preparation, the dedication. But, and there will always be that but, there will always be that eternal asterisk on the 1994 title. It doesn't matter how many times his fans say it was not proven that they used the illegal systems. It doesn't matter how many times they argue that he was fast anyway. The doubt is there, permanent, indelible. And in history, doubt is a condemnation. Do you know what the most ironic thing about all this is? Schumacher probably would have won that championship anyway. The guy was genuinely very fast. The Benetton, even without the cheating, had a competitive car. Ross Brawn was there as technical director, Rory Byrne as chief designer, Flavio Briatore managing the team. It was a top-notch team. But they didn't rely only on talent. They didn't want to leave it in the hands of fate. They wanted to be absolutely sure. They wanted to guarantee the victory. And in the process, they tainted a title that could have been clean and unquestionable. They preferred the dirty certainty to the clean victory. And think about the irony of fate. Flavio Briatore, that same Benetton boss, who laughed in everyone's face in 1994, was banned from Formula One in 2009 for another scandal, the Crashgate, when he ordered Nelson Piquet to crash on purpose in Singapore to favor Fernando Alonso. Cheating eventually catches up with you. Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne followed Schumacher to Ferrari and built a dynasty of 5 consecutive titles. But even those titles had their controversies. From the infamous intentional collision with Jacques Villeneuve in 1997 to the blatant team orders that Ferrari gave Rubens Barrichello to concede position to Schumacher. And the most fascinating thing of all is that we, Formula One fans, are still debating this 3 decades later. There are still people who fervently defend Benetton. There are still people who say Senna was just jealous. There are still people who argue that everyone cheated so it doesn't matter. And there are people like me who look at all the facts, all the evidence, all the subsequent admissions, and say, that was wrong, period. The truth is that Ayrton Senna's call was not just a technical warning about irregularities. It was much deeper than that. It was the cry of someone who truly loved Formula One, who respected competition above all else, who wanted to win cleanly and fairly. Senna had an almost spiritual relationship with that sport. For him, Formula One was art, it was science, it was a search for perfection. And seeing that being tainted by cheating, by shortcuts, by disrespect for the rules, was like seeing someone vandalize a masterpiece. Today, when you watch old 1994 races, when you see those absolutely perfect starts by Schumacher, when you see the Benetton flying through slow corners while other cars slide and struggle for traction, when you see the German making that car dance in a supernatural way, you simply know. And even if we cannot prove with 100% certainty that they used the illegal systems in every race, the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. And do you know what makes me saddest about this whole story? It's thinking about what could have been. Imagine if Senna had survived that accident in Imola. Imagine if he had continued to pressure the FIA. Imagine if he had been there when all those irregularities were discovered, one after the other. The man would have been vindicated. It would have been proven that he was right all along. Imagine Senna on the podium at the end of 1994, having won the championship cleanly after Benetton was finally adequately punished. Imagine him saying, "I told you so," with that penetrating gaze of his. Imagine the impact that would have had not only on him, but on the entire sport. It would have been a clear message. Cheating doesn't pay. Integrity wins in the end. But that's not what happened. Fate was cruel. Senna left too soon, and Schumacher continued winning. Benetton got a few fines here, a few suspensions there, but in the end, they kept the title. Briatore kept that cynical smile on his face, and the message that remained for many was exactly the opposite. It's worth the risk, it's worth cheating, because even if you get caught, the punishment is mild, and you still keep the trophy. And that affected Formula One in the following years. How many teams looked at 1994 and thought, Well, if Benetton managed to do that and only got a slap on the wrist, why shouldn't we try too? McLaren with Ferrari espionage in 2007, Ferrari with an irregular engine in 2019, Racing Point blatantly copying the Mercedes in 2020. The culture of cheating, of pushing the limits, of it's only illegal if you get caught became firmly established in the paddock. Look, I'm not naive. I know Formula One has always had cheating. Since the 50s, people have been trying to circumvent regulations. Jim Clark's Lotus had a suspension that was technically illegal. The six-wheeled Tyrrell P34 was a creative exploitation of a loophole in the rules. The famous fan car from Brabham that literally sucked the car to the ground. It has always been there. But 1994 was different. It was different because it involved safety at a time when 2 drivers had died. It was different because there was an obvious competitive imbalance caused by prohibited technology. It was different because the greatest driver in history made a direct warning and died before being vindicated. And it was different because the consequences were absolutely inadequate for the severity of the infractions. Do you know what personally angers me the most? It's that even today, in 2025, you find people who completely deny this story. People who say it's all a conspiracy theory, that Senna was just jealous, that there is no proof. And when you show them the admissions of Willem Toot, of Charlie Whiting, of the engineers in the documentaries, they simply ignore it or say it's out of context. It's the same denialist mentality we see in other areas of life. No matter how much evidence you present, no matter how many admissions from people involved you show, there will always be someone who prefers to believe the narrative that is convenient for them. And in the case of Formula One, many Schumacher fans simply don't want to accept that their idol's first title was tainted. And look, I understand the emotional resistance. It's difficult to accept that your hero may have won in a questionable way. It's difficult to reconcile the image of the genius Schumacher with the Schumacher who benefited from an illegal car. But reality doesn't care about our feelings. Facts are facts. The code was there, the systems worked, the irregularities were proven multiple times throughout the season. Subsequent admissions confirmed everything. That call from Senna was the beginning of a cascade of revelations that should have changed the result of that season. But they didn't. And that says a lot about Formula One as an institution, about how political power and money can influence even decisions that should be purely technical and based on regulations. Because let's be honest here, Benetton had a lot of political power. Flavio Briatore was extremely well connected. The team had the support of major sponsors. Schumacher was becoming a global star. There was a lot of money at stake. And the FIA, well, the FIA has always been a political entity as much as a regulatory one. If it were a small team, without political power, without major sponsors, doing exactly the same things that Benetton did in 1994, do you think the result would have been the same? Do you think it would have just been a few small fines and 2 races of suspension? Or would it have been complete disqualification from the season and a team ban? I think we all know the answer, and that is why Senna's call resonates to this day. It's not just about technical rules or software codes. It's about integrity. It's about playing fair. It's about respecting the sport and all the other competitors who are giving their best within the established rules. It's about not accepting that the end justifies the means. Senna represented those values. Yes, he was intense. Yes, he was sometimes controversial on track. Yes, he had his own questionable on-track battles with Prost. But when it came to technical regulation, to equipment integrity, he was inflexible. He wanted to win at the limit of talent, not at the limit of cheating. And there is one thing that many people forget in this whole story. The Williams FW16 that Senna was driving in 1994 was a problematic car, extremely problematic. When Patrick Head and Adrian Newey designed that car, they had counted on active suspension to balance certain aerodynamic characteristics. When active suspension was banned, the car was nervous, unpredictable, difficult to drive. Even so, it was fast, but it was unstable. Senna was fighting against that car every lap. He even told the team that there was something fundamentally wrong with the car, that the rear was too sensitive, that he didn't trust the behavior in fast corners. And even so, even fighting against a problematic car, he was still competitive, still starting on pole, still fighting for the win. Now imagine if Williams had simply ignored the regulations like Benetton did. Imagine if they had kept a hidden traction control system in the code, a secret launch control. With Senna's talent and those illegal systems helping to tame the nervous FW16, the championship would have been a blowout. There wouldn't even be a competition. But Williams was a traditional team with British values of fair play. Frank Williams and Patrick Head simply did not operate that way. They wanted to win clean or not win at all. And they paid the price for that integrity, being defeated by a team that did not have the same scruples. And here is another layer of this story that is rarely discussed. What happened to the other Benetton drivers? Jos Verstappen, who was Schumacher's teammate, never came close to the German's performance. In practice, in races, Verstappen was constantly a second and a half slower. Why? Did only Schumacher have access to the special systems? Did they release the secret codes only for the number one car? That is a question that has never been completely answered, but the data suggests yes, there was differential treatment. And that makes strategic sense. The fewer people who know the secret, the less chance of a leak. So you put the illegal systems only in the car of your number one driver, the guy who will fight for the title, and leave the other driver in the dark. Verstappen, incidentally, had a frustrating career in Formula One. He never managed to replicate what some thought would be a brilliant promise. And isn't it ironic that his son, Max Verstappen, is one of the greatest drivers on the grid today? But that's another story. Returning to 1994, there is another fascinating technical aspect that few people fully understand. Benetton's launch control system was sophisticated to the point of having multiple operating modes. It wasn't a simple button to press. They had programmed different launch profiles depending on track conditions, asphalt temperature, fuel level, even a forecast of grip based on historical data from that specific track. It was cutting-edge engineering, it was technological genius, but it was completely illegal. And that shows the level of investment they made in that system. It wasn't something done in a hurry. It wasn't an oops, we forgot to take it out of the code. It was a deliberate, extensive, expensive development. Hundreds of hours of engineering were invested in creating and perfecting it. And there are the secret tests. Because you don't think they developed all this only in theory, do you? They tested, most likely in private sessions on rented tracks away from the eyes of the FIA and rivals. How many laps were done developing and calibrating those illegal systems? How many engineers were involved? How many people knew the secret? An operation like this doesn't happen with 2 or 3 people. It required programmers, electronic engineers, mechanics, telemetry technicians. There must have easily been 20, 30 people who knew what was going on, and all of them kept the secret for years. Until the admissions began in the 2000s, almost no one spoke publicly. This speaks to the culture within that team. Briatore clearly established a code of silence. You didn't talk, you didn't admit, you took the secret to the grave if necessary. And many did. There are engineers who worked at Benetton in 1994 who still don't talk about the subject today. They simply refuse to give interviews or change the subject when questioned. But not everyone could carry the weight of conscience forever. Willem Todt was one of the first to break the silence in 2003, and he didn't do it lightly. The man agonized over whether he should speak or not. But eventually, the truth weighed more than loyalty to the team that no longer existed in that format. And when Todt spoke, it was like opening the floodgates. Other engineers started dropping hints here and there. Journalists who had received Senna's call returned to talk about the subject. The story began to solidify, the pieces began to fit together. And the picture that emerged was exactly what Senna had described in those urgent calls in 1994. There is a specific detail of those calls that few people know. Senna didn't just make one call. There were several, to different people, at different times, and in each one of them, he was extremely specific. He didn't make vague accusations. He described exactly what he suspected. They have traction control in the engine map. The start is electronically controlled. You have to check the injection system code. This level of specificity shows that Senna was not guessing. He was not making random accusations. He had done analysis, he had talked to his engineers, he had listened to the cars, he had seen the telemetry data available at the time. It was a serious technical investigation, not paddock gossip, and one of the people who received that call, a Brazilian journalist covering Formula One at the time, said years later that Senna's voice was different. It wasn't anger, it wasn't typical frustration, it was genuine concern. It was as if Senna was trying to protect the sport he loved from being corrupted, as if he saw it not just as an unfair competition, but as an existential threat to Formula One's credibility. And he was right, because after 1994, Formula One changed. The innocence was gone, credibility was shaken, fans began to question results. When someone was very dominant, the first question was no longer, wow, what an incredible driver, but rather, could there be something illegal in that car? This distrust permeates the sport to this day. Look at what happened with Mercedes from 2014 to 2020. Absurd dominance, right? And what did everyone say? There must be something illegal in the engine. That car is irregular. It needs to be investigated. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't, but the distrust was always there. And 1994 was one of the founding moments of this culture of suspicion. Likewise with Red Bull in recent years. Verstappen's dominance, and immediately theories emerge about flexible floors, about disguised traction control, about illegal aerodynamic tricks. It's always the same story repeating itself. And it all started, or at least was intensified, by cases like Benetton's in 1994. But returning to that specific year, there is one race that perfectly illustrates what was happening. The Monaco Grand Prix. Narrow track, slow and tight corners, a place where traction control is worth gold. Schumacher was flying in practice, completely dominant, and his pole position was almost 2 seconds faster than the second-place car. 2 seconds in Monaco. On a 1 minute and 20-second track, he was 2 seconds faster. That's an eternity. It's a difference that simply doesn't make sense with drivers of similar level and cars theoretically equivalent in terms of engine power. The only rational explanation is superior traction, superior grip coming out of those slow corners. And how do you get superior traction? With illegal electronics. In the race, Schumacher was leading comfortably when he hit the guardrail and retired. Many suspect to this day that he was under so much pressure from the FIA investigations that were starting to tighten that his concentration failed. Or perhaps the system was turned off for that specific race out of fear of extra inspection, and he couldn't drive the car without the electronic assistance he was accustomed to. And there is another revealing Grand Prix, the Spanish one. Schumacher won dominantly, but some mechanics from other teams who were close to the Benetton pit box during pit stops swore that they heard strange sounds coming from the B194 engine, a kind of irregular pulsation that suggested ignition cuts characteristic of traction control. It wasn't the smooth sound of an engine being manually modulated by the driver. It was a clearly audible electronic pattern. Of course, when questioned officially, no one wanted to put their name on the line and make formal accusations, because doing so meant entering a political war with Benetton and Briatore, and no one wanted that trouble. So everything remained in corridor conversations, in whispers in the paddock, in knowing glances between rival engineers. And that is one of the tragedies of the story. So many people knew, so many people suspected, so many people had circumstantial evidence, but the fear of political and legal reprisals kept everyone silent until it was too late, until the championship was decided, until Schumacher had the trophy in his hand. The FIA also failed monumentally in this. They had the power to conduct much more invasive technical checks. They could have confiscated the car after every race, dismantled everything, analyzed every chip, every line of code, but they didn't. They conducted superficial checks that a clever team like Benetton knew exactly how to pass. And why was the FIA lenient? Well, there are theories. Some say that Max Mosley, who was the FIA president at the time, had a close relationship with Briatore and did not want to completely destroy the team. Others say there was commercial pressure, that Bernie Ecclestone wanted a new young champion to sell to the German market. Still others say it was simply bureaucratic incompetence. It was probably a little of each. Politics, business, and incompetence mixing in a perfect recipe to allow cheating to flourish. And at the center of it all, an absurdly talented young German driver who probably didn't even need those tricks to be competitive, but who accepted the advantage without batting an eye. Because let's talk about Schumacher's responsibility in all this. To what extent did he know? To what extent was he involved? Some people try to exonerate him by saying that he was just driving, that he didn't know about the illegal systems. But that is naivety. An elite Formula One driver knows everything about his car. He works daily with the engineers, he discusses setup, he feels every change, every adjustment, and most importantly, he knows when electronic assistance is operating. You cannot hide traction control from a driver. He feels the power cut, he hears the engine pattern, he realizes he can be more aggressive on the throttle than should be possible. Schumacher knew. It is impossible that he didn't know. The question is, did he ask for it? Did he demand it? Or did he simply accept it when the team offered? We will probably never know the true answer, but his moral responsibility exists regardless. He consciously benefited from an illegal system. And that leads us to a broader reflection on ethics in sport. Where do we draw the line? Is it the team's fault or the driver's? Both. And what is the responsibility of the regulatory body in enforcing the rules? These are questions that go beyond Formula One. They apply to any competitive sport. In cycling, when systematic doping was discovered, athletes were banned, medals were withdrawn, records were erased. In Formula One, teams receive fines, drivers receive light suspensions, but the titles remain untouched. Why? Why does motorsports treat technical cheating more leniently than other sports treat doping? The answer probably lies in the nature of the sport. In Formula One, there has always been a culture of pushing the limits, of exploring gray areas in the regulations. It is part of the sport's DNA, but there is a difference between exploring a gray area and simply ignoring a clear rule. Traction control was explicitly banned. There was no ambiguity, no gray area. It was black and white, prohibited. And Benetton didn't try to argue that they had found a legal loophole. They simply denied using it, claimed that the code was residual, inactive. It was a weak defense that relied on the FIA's impossibility of proving activation during the races. And it worked, because the burden of proof was wrong. It should have been the opposite. Why do you have this in your code if it was prohibited? And any inadequate answer should result in disqualification. But that's not how it worked. And this precedent harmed the sport for decades. Teams learned that they could take risks, that even if they were caught, the consequences would be manageable. The title would remain, the prize money would remain, they would just have to pay some fines and maybe lose some points here and there. And Senna saw this coming. He understood that if Benetton got away with it, it would set a dangerous standard. That's why the urgency in his calls, that's why the insistence. He was trying to save not only his own season, but the long-term integrity of the sport. And in a way, he failed. Not for lack of effort, but because he was killed before he could exert continuous pressure. Without Senna pushing, without the biggest name in the sport demanding action, the FIA relaxed. They did the bare minimum necessary to look like they were investigating, but they didn't have the courage to take the drastic measures that would have been needed. Imagine if Senna had survived and become even more vocal about this. Imagine the political weight he would have, the pressure he could exert, the world media attention he could attract to the scandal. It would have been impossible for the FIA and Benetton to continue the charade. But fate was cruel. And with Senna's death, the story was gradually buried. It became a footnote in the history of that tragic season. The focus shifted to safety, to the deaths, to the changes in the cars. And Benetton's cheating, it remained a small asterisk that many prefer to ignore. But the truth has a way of eventually emerging. It can take years, it can take decades, but it emerges. And today, in 2025, 31 years later, we know the truth. We have the admissions, we have the evidence, we have former engineers confirming. The official story may not have changed, the title may still be registered as Schumacher's, but everyone who studies that era with intellectual honesty, knows what really happened. And that is the final lesson of this whole story. You can deceive people for a while. You can use political power, money, lawyers to keep the official version untouched. But you cannot deceive history. The truth eventually prevails, even if it is only in the court of informed public opinion. That call from Ayrton Senna was a watershed moment. It was the moment when the greatest legend in Formula One put his reputation on the line to denounce what he knew was wrong. He didn't have absolute proof at that moment, but he had moral certainty. He had the conviction of someone who knew his craft so deeply that he could detect when the laws of physics were being artificially challenged. And today, when we see young drivers arriving in Formula One, when we see the new generation competing, the story of 1994 serves as a cautionary tale. About what happens when you prioritize victory over integrity, about the moral cost of cheating, about how blemishes on reputation can last forever, no matter how many titles you subsequently win cleanly. Michael Schumacher had a brilliant career. No one can deny that. But that first title will always be questioned. There will always be a but. There will always be people like me telling this story, reminding people of what really happened. And that, my friends, is historical justice. It may not be official justice, it may not change the record books, but it is the judgment of posterity. And Senna? Well, Senna became immortal not only for his superhuman talent behind the wheel, but also for his integrity, for his refusal to accept mediocrity or dishonesty in the sport he loved. That call, that gesture of warning about the cheating, even knowing that it could create powerful enemies, that summarizes who Ayrton Senna was as a person. 31 years later, we are still talking about it, still analyzing, debating, looking for every new detail that emerges. And we will continue doing that for 30 more years and then another 30. Because this is a story that defines not just one season, but an entire era of Formula One. It is the story of when cheating almost destroyed the credibility of the sport and of when the greatest driver in the world tried to stop it. And in the end, perhaps Senna's greatest victory was not any of his 41 GPs won, nor his 3 world titles. Perhaps it was this, having the courage to make those calls, to denounce what was wrong, to try to protect the integrity of the sport even knowing that it could cost him dearly. That is legacy. That is immortality. Because in the end, titles are numbers in record books. Trophies rust, statistics are broken, but character, integrity, the courage to do what is right when it would be easier to stay silent, that transcends sport. That becomes human history, not just sports history. And when you watch those old images of Senna driving, when you see that yellow helmet tilting in the corners, those intense eyes through the visor, you are not just seeing a fast driver. You are seeing someone who truly loved it, who respected every rival, every fan, every person who dedicated their life to that sport. Someone who would not tolerate seeing it tarnished. The cruelest irony of this whole story is that Senna died chasing a clean victory against an opponent who was cheating. He was giving his all, extracting 100% from that problematic Williams, risking his life in every corner, all to compete on equal terms. And it wasn't on equal terms. The playing field was tilted, the rules were being broken, and he knew it, which made the frustration even more unbearable. On that fateful lap 7 in Imola, when he entered Tamburello for the last time, Senna was only a few positions behind Schumacher. He was planning his strategy, calculating when to attack, how to overtake. His brilliant mind was working in real time, processing 100 variables simultaneously, as he always did. But the car betrayed him. That unstable Williams, that problematic design that was never completely resolved, simply went off trajectory. And in an instant, it was all over. The greatest driver in the world, the man who had made those courageous calls, who had tried to warn everyone, was gone. And with him went the necessary pressure to truly clean up the sport. Damon Hill was a decent driver, but he didn't have Senna's political weight. He didn't have the voice, the presence, the power of mobilization. So Benetton continued its questionable practices, Schumacher continued winning, and the season followed its tainted course until that controversial ending in Adelaide. But here's what I want you to understand, and this is crucial. This story is not about diminishing Michael Schumacher as a driver. The German was genuinely brilliant, had extraordinary talent, revolutionized Formula One in many aspects. This story is about a system that failed. It's about a team that chose the wrong path. It's about a federation that didn't have the courage to enforce its own rules. And it's about a hero who tried to do the right thing and paid the ultimate price before seeing justice done. And do you know what else impresses me when I think about this whole story? It's that Senna didn't need to make those calls. He could have simply focused on extracting the maximum from his car, on working with his engineers to improve the Williams, on trying to win within the limitations he had. Many drivers would have done exactly that. It's not my problem if they are cheating, I will focus on my job. But Senna was not like that. For him, the sport was greater than any individual. The integrity of the competition was worth more than personal convenience. And that difference between him and other drivers, that willingness to stand up and speak even when it was inconvenient, even when it created problems, that is what separates good drivers from true legends. And look at the web of what-ifs this story creates. What if Senna had survived? What if the FIA had taken his complaints more seriously from the beginning? What if Benetton had been completely disqualified in May when the illegal codes were discovered? How different would not only 1994 be, but the entire subsequent history of Formula One? Would Schumacher still have gone to Ferrari? Would he still have dominated the turn of the millennium? The entire history of the sport could have taken a completely different course. But we cannot rewrite the past. We can only learn from it. And the lesson here is crystal clear. Cheating can bring results in the short term. It can give you victories, trophies, even championships. But in the long term, the truth emerges. Your reputation is stained. Your achievements are eternally questioned. And you lose something much more valuable than any title. You lose the respect of those who truly understand the sport. Today, when Formula One historians make their lists of the greatest drivers of all time, Senna is always at the top or near it. Schumacher too, of course, because the numbers are undeniable. But when you read the deeper analyses, there is always that reservation about 1994. There is always that asterisk, and that will never go away no matter how much time passes. And there is another dimension to this story that is rarely explored: the psychological impact on other drivers and teams. How many engineers at Williams, at McLaren, at Ferrari stayed up at night in 1994 thinking, should we also cheat? If that's how the game is being played, should we play the same way? It's a brutal moral dilemma. Do you maintain your principles and accept losing, or do you abandon ethics to compete on equal terms? Most teams chose to maintain integrity, at least that year, but the temptation was there, and the precedent was being set. In the following years, other teams began to test the limits more aggressively. The culture of aggressively innovating became code for finding creative ways to circumvent the rules. And it all goes back to moments like 1994 when cheating seemed to pay off. So when I think about that call from Senna, I think of it as an inflection point. Not an inflection point that immediately changed things, but one that planted a seed. The seed of resistance against the normalization of cheating. The seed of the idea that some values are worth more than victories. And this seed, watered by the tears of millions of fans who lost their hero, eventually grew. It grew in the safety reforms that came after Imola. It grew in the more rigorous technical inspection that was implemented in the following years. It grew in the sport's collective memory that there are lines that should not be crossed. It didn't happen fast. It didn't happen completely. But it happened, gradually, over decades. And every time a new generation discovers this story, every time a young fan watches a documentary about 1994, every time someone like me tells this story with all the details, that seed grows a little more. Because the story is not just about what happened, it's about what should have happened. It's about the ideal versus reality. It's about aspiring to be better. Senna represented that ideal. He was not perfect. No human is. But in crucial moments, when it really mattered, he chose the side of integrity. And those telephone calls in March and April 1994, those urgent warnings about the illegal Benetton, were exactly that. a man choosing to do what was right even when it was difficult, even when it could create powerful enemies, even when it would be easier to simply ignore. And in the end, my friends, that is the story we need to tell. Not just to honor Senna, although that is important. Not just to point out the mistakes of Benetton and the FIA, although that is necessary, but mainly to remind ourselves in the present here in 2025 that integrity matters, that ethics matter, that how you win matters as much as winning. Because if all that matters is the result, if the end justifies any means, if victory at all costs is the only value, then we lose the essence of what makes sport meaningful. Sport is about human excellence, about overcoming limits within agreed rules, about fair competition where the best prevails. When you remove fairness from the equation, when you allow cheating to flourish, you destroy the very soul of competition. And Senna understood this viscerally. That's why the urgency in those calls. That's why the insistence. He was trying to save the soul of Formula One. And although he lost the battle of 1994, although he did not live to see his complaints completely vindicated, he won the most important war. He planted a flag in the moral ground and said, "This is what matters." 31 years later, here we are, still debating, still analyzing, still being inspired by a man who made urgent telephone calls trying to defend what was right. If that is not legacy, if that is not immortality, I don't know what is. So when you think of Ayrton Senna, yes, remember the impossible pole positions, remember the heart-stopping overtakes, remember the glorious victories in the rain, remember the 3 world titles, but remember those telephone calls too. Remember a man who could have stayed quiet and chose to speak. Remember someone who valued integrity as much as speed. And when you think of 1994, don't just think of the tragedy of Imola. Think of the scandal that was revealed afterward. Think of the secret codes, the illegal systems, the subsequent admissions that confirmed everything. Think of how history proved Senna was right. It proved his suspicions were founded. It proved his sense of justice was pointing in the correct direction. And finally, when you look at Michael Schumacher and that first world title, look with open eyes. Recognize the extraordinary talent. Recognize the subsequent achievements, but also recognize the stain. Recognize that victories built on unstable foundations will never be completely solid. Recognize that history has a long memory. Because in the end, ladies and gentlemen, after all the technical details, all the investigations, all the controversies, the lesson is simple and eternal. Integrity is non-negotiable. Character defines legacy more than trophies. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way to the light. That call from Ayrton Senna was a defining moment in Formula One history. A moment that showed that there is something more important than winning. That there is something called integrity. That there is something called doing the right thing. And as long as there are people who care enough to tell this story, to keep the memory alive, to insist that the truth matters, Senna continues to win. Not in the official statistics. Not in the record books. But in the place that truly matters. In the heart and conscience of everyone who truly loves racing. That was the story of the call that revealed Formula One's biggest scandal. The story of when Ayrton Senna tried to save the sport he loved. And although he did not live to see complete justice, although the system failed when it mattered most, his courage in that moment inspires us to this day. Because true heroes are not defined only by their victories. They are defined by the moments when they choose to do the right thing, even when it is difficult, even when it is dangerous, even when the world is not ready to listen. Ayrton Senna made those calls. He warned about the cheating, he defended integrity, and 31 years later, we are still here telling his story, proving he was right. The truth always wins in the end, always.